What's going on, everyone? Before we dive into the absolutely wild world of medieval drinking, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss out on any of our historical deep dives. Trust me, after today's video, you'll never look at Happy Hour the same way again. And if you think modern hangovers are bad, just wait until you hear about what people went through after a night of medieval fun. Let's paint a picture. You think you know what it means to get drunk? You think your college days or that wild Friday night where you woke up in a stranger's apartment was intense? Well, buckle up, because we're about to transport you back to medieval Europe, where getting wasted wasn't just a recreational activity. It was practically a survival strategy, a social necessity, and a guaranteed path to some of the most horrific experiences your body could endure. Here's the thing. You wouldn't last a single night of medieval drinking, not one. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why the good old days of tavern life were actually a nightmare soaked in questionable liquids and regret. Chapter 1. Why everyone was drunk. All the time, and it wasn't by choice. Let's start with something that'll blow your mind. In medieval times, being drunk wasn't just common, it was practically mandatory for survival. And no, I'm not exaggerating for effect. Picture this. You wake up in your medieval hovel, you're thirsty, your mouth feels like you've been chewing on wool all night. You stumble over to your water source, maybe a well, maybe a stream, maybe just a barrel that's been sitting in the corner collecting whatever falls into it. You dip your cup in and take a big gulp. Congratulations, you've just given yourself a death sentence. See, medieval water was absolutely disgusting. We're not talking about, this tastes a bit off disgusting. We're talking about, this water is literally teeming with bacteria, parasites, and the runoff from your neighbour's latrine. Disgusting. Rivers and streams were open sewers. Wells were contaminated. Even rainwater collection was sketchy at best, because it was sitting in containers that were never properly cleaned. People didn't understand germ theory yet. They had no idea that the invisible little organisms in their water were causing the constant dysentery, cholera, and typhoid that swept through medieval communities like clockwork. All they knew was that drinking water made you sick. Really sick. Dead sick. But you know what didn't make you sick? Alcohol. The fermentation process that creates alcohol also kills most of the harmful bacteria and parasites that would otherwise destroy your intestines. So medieval people, and I mean everyone from toddlers to grandmothers, drank fermented beverages for literally every meal. Breakfast, ale, lunch, more ale, dinner. You guessed it, ale. And if you were lucky enough to afford it, wine. Now, when I say ale, I need you to forget everything you know about the craft IPAs and smooth lagers you enjoy today. Medieval ale was a completely different beast. It was thick, cloudy, often sour, and had the consistency of thin oatmeal. It was brewed without hops in most places. Hops didn't become standard until later, which meant it spoiled quickly, sometimes within days. The alcohol content was lower than modern beer, usually around 1 to 3%, which meant you had to drink a lot of it to stay hydrated. And drink a lot they did. The average medieval adult consumed somewhere between 1 to 2 gallons of ale per day. Let that sink in. 2 gallons. That's 16 pints. Every single day. Children drank a weaker version called small ale, but they were still putting away impressive quantities. But here's where it gets interesting, because everyone was constantly maintaining a low-level buzz. Just to avoid dying of dysentery, the concept of drunk was completely different. You weren't considered drunk if you were just sipping ale all day. That was normal. That was baseline existence. You were only considered truly drunk, or wasted, as we might say today, when you went beyond the maintenance drinking and really started pounding the strong stuff. And when medieval people decided to get actually drunk, that's when things got absolutely insane. Chapter 2. The tavern, your gateway to questionable decisions. So you've decided you want to experience a real medieval night out. You've finished your work for the day. Maybe you've been hauling manure or hammering horseshoes or scraping animal hides until your hands are raw. You're exhausted, you're covered in filth, and you want to forget about the fact that you'll have to do the exact same thing tomorrow, and the day after that, and every day until you die, which will probably be pretty soon. Time to head to the tavern. Now, forget everything you know about modern bars. Forget the neon signs, the polished counters, the carefully curated cocktail menus, and the health inspections. A medieval tavern was basically someone's house where they happened to sell alcohol. That's it. That's the whole business model. You push open the wooden door, there's no handle, just a piece of rope, and immediately you're hit with a wall of sensory assault that would make you gag. The smell is what gets you first. It's a magnificent cocktail of unwashed bodies. Remember, bathing is considered dangerous and potentially immoral. Stale ale soaked into the earthen floor, smoke from the central fire pit, and the vague odour of something rotting in the corner that everyone has just accepted as part of the ambience. The lighting is terrible. There might be a few tallow candles burning, made from rendered animal fat that smells about as good as you'd imagine, or maybe just the firelight from the central hearth. Your eyes water from the smoke because chimneys aren't really a thing yet, and windows are small, glass is expensive, and opening your windows lets in the cold and the smell of the actual sewer running down the street outside. The floor is packed dirt mixed with rushes, basically medieval carpet made of reeds and grass that are supposed to soak up spilled drinks and other fluids. Except these rushes probably haven't been changed in months, so they're essentially a biological hazard zone, harbouring every bacteria and parasite you can imagine. People throw food scraps, spit, vomit and worse onto these rushes, and they just sit there, fermenting in their own medieval soup of horror. The furniture is rough-hewn benches and tables that wobble and have more splinters than smooth surfaces. There are no individual chairs in most establishments. You're packed onto benches with strangers shoulder to shoulder, breathing in their ale-scented breath and whatever diseases they're carrying. And the crowd? Oh, the crowd is something else. You've got day labourers, still covered in the evidence of their work, merchants trying to close deals while getting progressively drunker, off-duty soldiers looking for trouble, travelling merchants who haven't bathed since they left the last town 3 weeks ago, pickpockets and con artists working the room, prostitutes negotiating prices, and everyone, absolutely everyone, is armed. That's right. Most men are carrying at least a knife, if not a sword or a club. There are no weapon checks at medieval taverns. The idea of checking your weapon at the door would be laughable. These implements are tools as much as weapons, and besides, you might need them when the inevitable tavern fight breaks out in an hour or two. You squeeze onto a bench between a blacksmith who smells like burned hair and iron, and a farmer who apparently decided that the layer of pig manure on his clothes was fine tavern attire. You catch the attention of the tavern keeper, probably the owner's wife, since brewing was often women's work, and she brings you a wooden cup filled with ale. The cup, by the way, has never been properly washed. There's no hot running water, no dish soap, no sanitizer. At best, it got a quick rinse with cold water after the last customer. More likely, it just got dumped out and immediately refilled. The rim has suspicious stains that you're trying very hard not to think about. But you're thirsty, and this is what everyone does, so you take a drink. The ale is, well, it's not good. It's definitely not what you'd call refreshing. It's lukewarm. No refrigeration, remember. Slightly sour and has visible particles floating in it. You can't tell if those particles are grain remnants from the brewing process, or something that fell into the barrel. You decide not to investigate too closely and just keep drinking, and this is where your night really begins. Chapter 3. The drinks that'll destroy you. So you've made it to the tavern, you've claimed your spot on a questionable bench, and you've got your first cup of ale. But if you really want to get wasted medieval style, you need to understand the full arsenal of alcoholic destruction available to you. Let's start with the standard offering, ale. As I mentioned, this is the everyday drink, the liquid bread that keeps people hydrated and barely functional. Most tavern ale sits at around 2 to 4% alcohol by volume. You can drink this all day and maintain a nice buzz without completely losing your faculties. But this isn't what gets you wasted. This is just the foundation. When you want to step it up, you ask for the strong ale. This is ale that's been brewed with more grain and allowed to ferment longer, pushing the alcohol content up to maybe 6 to 8%. It's thicker, stronger, and hits you harder. 3 or 4 cups of this, and you're starting to feel really good. Or really bad. It depends on whether you ate anything today, and let's be honest, you probably didn't eat much because food is expensive, and you're poor. Then there's wine. Oh, wine. In medieval times, wine isn't the sophisticated drink of the elite that it is today. Well, actually, the good wine is. But that's not what you're getting at this tavern. The wine available to common folk is rough, acidic stuff that's either locally produced from whatever grapes can survive the climate, or it's been imported and has spent weeks or months being transported in barrels that may or may not have been properly sealed. Wine has the advantage of higher alcohol content, usually 9 to 12%, which means you can get drunk faster with less volume. The disadvantage is that it tastes like vinegar mixed with sadness, and it will absolutely destroy your stomach, especially on an empty stomach. But who cares about tomorrow's stomach pain when you're trying to forget today's misery? Now, if you really want to enter the danger zone, you need to know about the specialty drinks. These are the medieval equivalent of doing shots, except infinitely more dangerous. There's mead, honey wine, which sounds delightful until you remember that medieval mead wasn't the carefully crafted beverage you might find at a Renaissance fair today. It was often poorly made, over-fermented, and could range anywhere from 8% to 18% alcohol, depending on how much honey went into it and how long it fermented. The honey was expensive, so mead was usually reserved for special occasions, or for people with more money. But when it showed up at the tavern, people drank it like it was going out of style. Then there's braggot, a horrifying mixture of ale and mead that combines the worst qualities of both. It's strong, it's sweet, it's likely to make you violently ill, and people loved it. But the real killer, the drink that separates the casual drinkers from the people who wake up 3 days later in a ditch, is aqua vitae. Water of life, they called it, which is ironic because it was absolutely capable of killing you. Aqua vitae was distilled spirits. The medieval world was just beginning to figure out distillation, and what they created was essentially moonshine. We're talking 40 to 60% alcohol or higher, distilled from wine or fermented grains, and it was rough. There was no aging process, no smoothing out the burn. It was clear or slightly coloured. It tasted like fire and regret, and it would strip the enamel off your teeth. People didn't drink aqua vitae for pleasure. They drank it to get absolutely obliterated as quickly as possible, or they used it as medicine, which tells you something about how desperate medieval medicine was. A few cups of this stuff, and you weren't just drunk. You were in another dimension of consciousness entirely. And here's the thing, there was no standardization. Every batch was different. The tavern keeper might tell you this batch of strong ale is the same as last week's, but there's no quality control, no alcohol percentage labels, nothing. You're essentially playing Russian roulette with every drink. One cup might be relatively mild, the next might knock you on your back. Oh, and let's not forget about the additives. To make their drinks more appealing, or to mask the taste of spoilage, medieval brewers and tavern keepers would add all sorts of things to their beverages. Herbs, spices, honey, fruit. These were the innocent additions. But sometimes they'd add other substances to make weak drinks seem stronger, or to give them interesting effects. We're talking about things like henbane, mandrake, or other plants that were not only psychoactive but potentially toxic. So when you're sitting in that tavern, drinking cup after cup, you're not just getting drunk on alcohol. You might be ingesting all sorts of other compounds that are messing with your brain chemistry in unpredictable ways. That special recipe the tavern keeper is so proud of, it might contain ingredients that would be illegal in any modern setting, but you don't know any of this. You just know that the drinks keep coming, you keep drinking, and the world is starting to get very, very fuzzy around the edges. Chapter 4. The Social Pressure and Drinking Culture. Now, before we get to the part where you're face down in those disgusting floor rushes, we need to talk about why you're drinking so much in the first place. Because medieval drinking wasn't just about getting drunk, it was a complex social activity with rules, expectations, and serious consequences for not participating. First, understand that the tavern is one of the only social spaces available to common people. You don't have community centres, movie theatres, or coffee shops. You have church and you have the tavern, and the tavern is significantly more fun than church. This is where you catch up on news, hear gossip, make business deals, find work, arrange marriages, settle disputes, and generally participate in community life. And all of that happens while drinking, heavily. Refusing to drink with someone is a serious social insult. If a fellow tradesman offers to buy you a drink, you accept. If someone wants to toast to something, you participate. If the whole table is doing rounds, you keep up. Not drinking suggests you think you're better than everyone else, or that you don't trust them, or that you're not really part of the community. There are actual drinking rituals you're expected to follow. The loving cup ceremony involves a large communal cup passed around the group, with each person taking a drink. You can't refuse without causing offence, never mind that you're essentially sharing backwash and diseases with everyone at the table. This is about solidarity and community. Toasting is serious business. When someone raises their cup, you raise yours. When they declare the toast, you echo it. When they drink, you drink. Refusing a toast is grounds for a fight, and there are approximately 17 million things that need to be toasted in a medieval tavern. The king, the local lord, successful harvests, dead friends, living friends, someone's new baby, someone's new business venture, the weather, the success of tomorrow's hunt. Everything is an excuse for another round. Then there are drinking games. Oh yes, medieval people had drinking games, and they were absolutely brutal. One popular game involved trying to drain your cup in one go when someone shouted a certain phrase. Another involved passing a cup around while singing a song. If you were holding the cup when the song ended, you had to drink it all. There were dice games where losers had to drink, riddle contests with the same penalty, and various tests of skill that all ended with someone having to consume more alcohol. The peer pressure was intense. Your masculinity was often measured by your ability to hold your drink. If you couldn't keep up with the other men at the table, you were weak, unmanly, not a true member of the community. For women who drank in taverns, and some did, despite it being somewhat scandalous, there was a different kind of pressure, but it was pressure nonetheless. And here's the kicker: walking away wasn't really an option. Medieval work schedules didn't follow the modern 9-to-5 structure. You worked when there was light and when there was work to do. Social obligations in the evening weren't just fun. They were where you maintained the relationships that kept you employed, housed, and protected. Insulting someone by refusing to drink with them could cost you work opportunities, business partnerships, or even physical safety. Plus, there was genuine camaraderie in these drinking sessions. These were your people, the ones who understood the grinding difficulty of your life, because they were living it too. Sharing drinks was sharing misery, sharing small victories, and creating bonds in one of the few ways available. In a world without social media, text messages, or even reliable mail service, face-to-face drinking sessions were how you maintained your entire social network. So you keep drinking, round after round, toast after toast, game after game. After, the room gets louder, hotter, smokier. The conversations get more animated. Someone starts singing a bawdy song and everyone joins in, even though half the people can barely remember the words. Arguments break out over trivial matters and are settled with more drinking. Someone swears eternal friendship to someone else they just met tonight and will probably never see again. And through it all, you keep pouring alcohol into your system, because this is what you do. This is your entertainment, your social life, your escape, and your cultural obligation all rolled into one increasingly blurry experience. The worst part. There's no concept of, I need to work tomorrow, so I should take it easy. Everyone needs to work tomorrow. Everyone has to get up at dawn and perform back-breaking labour while nursing whatever condition their body is in. But that's tomorrow's problem. Right now, tonight, you're going to drink until you can't anymore, because this is the only relief you're going to get from the relentless grind of medieval existence. Chapter 5. The immediate effects and why they're worse than you think. All right. You've been in the tavern for a few hours now. You've had, let's see, maybe 6 or 7 cups of regular ale, 3 cups of strong ale, and someone convinced you to try the wine, which was a terrible decision. Your stomach is sloshing, your head is swimming, and the world has taken on a very interesting tilt. Let's talk about what's happening to your body right now, and why the medieval drinking experience is so much worse than your modern hangovers. First, dehydration. Yes, I know, you've been drinking liquids all night, but alcohol is a diuretic, meaning it makes you urinate more than you're taking in fluids. In the modern world, you might alternate alcoholic drinks with water, or at least drink water before bed. In medieval times, you're not drinking water. You can't drink water safely, remember? So you're dehydrating yourself with alcohol, and there's no safe way to rehydrate. Oh, and speaking of urination, where exactly do you think you're doing that? There's no bathroom in this tavern. There might be a chamber pot in the corner that's already overflowing. There might be a bucket outside the back door. More likely you're just stepping out into the alley behind the tavern and adding to the river of urine and feces that's already flowing down the street's central gutter. And then you're walking back into the tavern with whatever you've stepped in still on your shoes and sitting back down to continue drinking. The vitamin and nutrient deficiencies you're already suffering from, because medieval diets are terrible, are being exacerbated by the alcohol. Your body is desperately trying to process the ethanol, which requires B vitamins, but you're not getting nearly enough B vitamins in your diet to begin with. This is setting you up for malnutrition effects on top of drunkenness. Your blood sugar is crashing. You probably didn't eat much today. Maybe some bread, maybe some pottage. And alcohol is wreaking havoc on your glucose levels. This is making you shaky, sweaty, and increasingly irrational. In the modern world, you might stumble to a late-night food truck or order pizza. In medieval times, the best you might get is some stale bread or a piece of cheese if you can afford it. Most likely you're just drinking on an increasingly empty stomach. The smoke in the tavern is making everything worse. Your eyes are burning, you're coughing, and the lack of oxygen is compounding the effects of the alcohol. You're not just drunk, you're mildly hypoxic, which is making you dizzier and more confused than alcohol alone would cause. And remember those mysterious additives I mentioned earlier. If the drinks you've been consuming contained any psychoactive herbs, you're not just experiencing normal drunkenness. You might be hallucinating slightly. Colours might seem more vivid or strange. Sounds might be distorted. You might feel paranoid or euphoric in waves that don't quite match the normal progression of intoxication. Your fine motor control is gone. When you try to lift your cup, you knock it over. When you try to stand up, you bump into the table. then the bench, then the person next to you. Your speech is slurred beyond recognition. The clever comment you thought you were making comes out as incomprehensible mumbling. Emotionally, you're a wreck. The alcohol has demolished your inhibitions and your emotional regulation. You might be crying about something that happened 5 years ago. You might be declaring your undying love for the stranger next to you. You might be picking a fight with someone twice your size over an imagined slight. 1 minute you're laughing hysterically at nothing in particular, the next you're melancholic and philosophical about the meaning of life. And here's something modern drinkers don't usually deal with. You're probably surrounded by people who are just as drunk as you are, and they're all armed. That guy who just bumped into you, he's got a knife on his belt, he's had even more to drink than you have, and he's having a really bad week. The argument happening 2 tables over is getting louder, and someone just stood up with their hand on their weapon. The woman in the corner who's been drinking since noon is now screaming at someone about some perceived betrayal. Violence in medieval taverns wasn't an occasional occurrence, it was expected. The combination of alcohol, weapons, close quarters, and people who already live hard, brutal lives is a recipe for disaster. Fights break out over nothing. Someone says something insulting. Someone looks at someone else the wrong way. Someone accuses someone else of cheating at dice. And suddenly there are fists flying, furniture breaking, and blades being drawn. You, in your intoxicated state, now have to navigate this environment. Your reaction time is shot. Your judgment is impaired. You can't run effectively because you can barely walk. If violence erupts near you, you're either getting involved whether you want to or not, or you're becoming collateral damage. And we haven't even gotten to the truly unpleasant physical symptoms yet. Your stomach, which has been forced to process all this alcohol and mysterious additives on minimal food, is staging a rebellion. The nausea is building. You're sweating, partly from the alcohol, partly from being crammed in a hot, smoky room with dozens of other people. You know what's coming. Your stomach knows what's coming. Everyone in the tavern knows what's coming because they've all been here before. You're going to vomit. The only question is whether you make it outside first, or if you're about to add to the biological disaster zone that is the tavern floor. Chapter 6. The blackout zone and loss of control. So the nausea has been building, and you've made a decision. You're going to try to make it outside before you lose the contents of your stomach. You attempt to stand up. This is a mistake. The world tilts violently. What you thought was vertigo before was nothing compared to this. The room isn't just spinning. It's actively rotating on multiple axes like some kind of horrific carnival ride. You grab onto the table for support, but your hands don't seem to be receiving accurate information from your brain about where the table actually is. So you mostly just flail at empty air before finally making contact. You're in what we would now call the blackout zone. Your blood alcohol content is so high that your brain is no longer forming new memories properly. You might not remember any of what's about to happen, which is probably for the best, but right now you're living through it in real time. You lurch toward what you think is the door. You're wrong. You've somehow turned completely around and you're heading toward the back wall. Someone grabs your shoulder and spins you in the right direction, not out of kindness, but because you were about to knock over their drinks. You mumble something that might be thanks or might be an insult. Even you're not sure. The journey to the door is an epic saga. You're bumping into everyone. You step on someone's foot. You accidentally grab someone's shoulder for balance and they shove you away. You nearly fall into the fire pit, which would have been absolutely catastrophic, but someone pulls you back. You have no idea who. You won't remember any of this tomorrow. Finally, you make it outside. The cold night air hits you like a physical force, and instead of making you feel better, it makes everything infinitely worse. The temperature difference is shocking your system. You stagger a few steps from the door, and then it happens. You vomit. Violently. Comprehensively. Your body is rejecting everything you've put into it over the last several hours. The ale, the wine, the strong ale, that mysterious meat pie someone convinced you to eat around hour 3. All of it is coming back up. Your stomach muscles are contracting so hard you think you might turn inside out. You're on your hands and knees in what is definitely a mixture of mud and sewage, and you're adding to it enthusiastically. But here's the thing about medieval vomiting that makes it so much worse than the modern equivalent. There's no running water to rinse your mouth. There's no mint gum or breath freshener. There's no friend holding your hair back or making sure you're okay. You're alone in an alley in the dark, covered in your own sick. And when you're done, the best you can do is maybe wipe your mouth on your sleeve. And remember, you can't drink water to rinse your mouth or rehydrate. The only liquid available to you is more alcohol back in the tavern. Some people do go back in after vomiting. They consider it making room for more drinking. They rinse their mouth with ale and keep going. You might be one of these people. You might stagger back inside, reclaim your spot, and keep drinking because the social pressure is that strong and you're that far past making good decisions. Or you might have hit your limit. You might be done. But here's the problem. You need to get home. In the modern world, this is where you'd call an Uber, or ask a friend to drive you, or at worst, stumble to a nearby subway. In medieval times, you're walking, in the dark, through streets that aren't lit, that aren't paved, that are filled with obstacles and hazards and very real dangers. Medieval cities didn't have street lights. If there's a moon out, that helps, but if it's cloudy or a new moon, you're navigating by basically feeling your way forward. The streets are narrow, winding, and completely illogical. There are no street signs. There are no addresses. You navigate by knowing that you live near the baker's shop, 3 doors down from the blacksmith, but right now you can barely remember your own name, let alone complex navigation instructions. The streets are also dangerous in ways that go beyond just tripping over things. Crime rates at night are astronomical because there's no police force. There are watchmen in larger cities, but they're few and far between, and they're not going to hear you if something happens. Thieves love drunk people staggering home from taverns. You're easy targets with whatever money you have left and no ability to defend yourself. You're stumbling through the darkness, bouncing off walls, stepping in things you really don't want to think about. Maybe you fall into a ditch. Maybe you sit down to rest for just a minute and pass out against a building. Maybe you take a wrong turn and end up in a completely different part of town. If you're lucky, you live close to the tavern. If you're unlucky, you've got a half-mile walk or more through this medieval obstacle course, while your brain is soaked in alcohol and your body is actively shutting down non-essential functions. And here's a truly and terrifying possibility. You might not make it home at all. People died from exposure in medieval cities all the time. If you pass out in the wrong place on a cold night, you might not wake up. If you fall into a ditch or a stream while this intoxicated, you could drown in a few inches of water because you lack the coordination to get yourself out. If you wander into the wrong neighborhood or encounter the wrong people, you could be robbed and beaten, and there's no emergency services to call. Some people didn't bother trying to get home. They'd just find a doorway or an alcove and sleep there, hoping they didn't freeze to death or get robbed before morning. Others would pay a few coins to sleep on the floor of the tavern itself, crammed in with other unconscious drunks in that horrible smoke-filled room. But let's say you do make it home. You somehow navigate the dark streets, avoid all the hazards, and make it to your dwelling. You collapse onto your bed, which is probably a straw. Mattress on the floor, possibly shared with your entire family, and you pass out. This is where the real suffering begins. Chapter 7. The Medieval Hangover from Hell. You wake up, or rather, you regain consciousness. It's difficult to call what you're experiencing waking up. because it implies some kind of peaceful transition from sleep to wakefulness, and this is anything but peaceful. First, there's the headache. Oh, the headache. Your skull feels like it's being used as an anvil by an enthusiastic blacksmith. Every heartbeat sends a wave of pain through your head. The throbbing is so intense that you can feel it behind your eyes, in your jaw, down your neck. In the modern world, you'd reach for ibuprofen or aspirin. In medieval times, pain relief doesn't exist in any meaningful form. You might have access to willow bark tea if you're lucky. It contains salicylic acid, the compound that aspirin is derived from. But brewing that requires getting up, finding willow bark, making a fire, heating water, and waiting for it to steep. And right now, the idea of doing any of those things seems impossible. Plus, the willow bark tea tastes absolutely terrible and might make your stomach situation even worse. Speaking of your stomach, the nausea is back with a vengeance. Your digestive system is staging a full revolt. You might need to vomit again, but there's nothing left except bile. Your stomach acid is eating away at your throat. The sour taste in your mouth is beyond description. It's like something died in there, which isn't far from the truth considering medieval dental hygiene. Your mouth is so dry that your tongue feels like leather. You're desperately thirsty, but here's the catch-22 that makes medieval hangovers especially cruel. You need to rehydrate, but you can't drink water safely. Your only option is to drink more alcohol, maybe some small ale to take the edge off. This is actually a common practice. People would drink themselves through their hangovers because it was the only liquid available. This creates a vicious cycle. You're dehydrated from drinking, so you drink more, which dehydrates you further, so you need to drink more. Some people would stay in this cycle for days, never quite sober, never quite drunk, just maintaining a constant state of mild intoxication and low-grade misery. Your entire body aches. Medieval beds are not comfortable under the best circumstances. You're talking about a sack stuffed with straw that's probably mouldy and definitely infested with lice and fleas. You've been lying on this in whatever position you collapsed in, probably still wearing your clothes from yesterday, which are now covered in various substances you'd rather not think about. Every muscle is sore, partly from the alcohol's effect on your system, partly from whatever physical activities you engaged in last night. Dancing, fighting, stumbling through streets. Your back hurts, your legs hurt, your arms hurt, everything hurts, and you have no pain medication, no hot shower, no comfortable place to recover. The room is spinning even though you're lying still. You try to open your eyes, but the light, even the dim light filtering through whatever crude window covering you have, is like knives stabbing into your brain. You close them again. The spinning continues. You're also probably experiencing what we'd now recognize as alcohol poisoning symptoms. Tremors, cold sweats, racing heartbeat, confusion. Maybe some hallucinations if the drinks you consumed last night had those mysterious additives. Your liver is working overtime trying to process the toxins you dumped into your system, and it's struggling. But here's the thing, you can't just stay in bed and recover. You don't have sick days, you don't have the luxury of calling in hungover. If you don't work, you don't eat. If you don't fulfill your obligations, you lose your position, your home, your livelihood. So you're going to have to get up and function, despite feeling like death would be a welcome relief. You force yourself to sit up. This is a monumental task. The room does several complete rotations. Your stomach lurches. You might vomit again. Dry heaving because there's nothing left to expel. You're sweating and shivering at the same time. Eventually, through sheer force of will, you get to your feet. Standing is an accomplishment. Walking to the door without falling over is a miracle. You step outside into the morning light, and it's like stepping into the surface of the sun. Your hangover-sensitive eyes can barely handle the brightness. Your headache intensifies, but you have to work. So you stagger to whatever your job is. Maybe the fields, maybe a workshop, maybe hauling goods for a merchant. and you have to perform physical labor while every movement makes you want to die, while your head is pounding, while your stomach is threatening rebellion, while you're still probably mildly drunk from last night. Your co-workers are in the same condition. Everyone is hungover. This is just normal. The guy working next to you is green and sweating. The person across the way keeps stopping to dry heave. Everyone is moving more slowly than usual, working through the pain, waiting for the day to be over so they can go back to the tavern and do it all over again. Because that's the real kicker. This isn't a one-time thing. This is your life. This cycle of working, drinking, suffering, and working again is the pattern of your existence. You'll be back at the tavern tonight, because where else are you going to go? What else are you going to do? The alternative is sitting alone in your miserable dwelling, fully sober and aware of how terrible your life is. At least when you're drunk, you can forget for a few hours. Chapter 8. The health consequences nobody talked about now. Let's talk about what all this drinking is doing to your body long term, because medieval people are experiencing health consequences that modern medicine has well documented, but they have no concept of. First, your liver is absolutely destroyed. Cirrhosis of the liver, the scarring and hardening of liver tissue from chronic alcohol abuse, is rampant in medieval populations, but nobody understands what it is or what causes it. You just know that you're always tired, your skin and eyes have a yellowish tint, your belly is swollen and distended, and you're frequently nauseous. You might think you're cursed or suffering from an imbalance of humours. You have no idea that your liver is essentially turning into scar tissue and losing its ability to function. The monks who keep medical records notice that certain people develop a characteristic appearance: the swollen belly, the yellow skin, the thin limbs. But they attribute this to various sins or constitutional weaknesses. They don't make the connection to the gallons of alcohol these people have consumed over years. Your heart is also taking a beating. Chronic heavy drinking causes cardiomyopathy, a weakening of the heart muscle. Your heart might be enlarged, beating irregularly, struggling to pump blood effectively. You experience shortness of breath, fatigue, and swelling in your legs and feet. Again, medieval people notice these symptoms, but attribute them to dropsy or other poorly understood conditions. Your brain is being permanently altered. We now know that chronic alcohol abuse causes brain shrinkage, memory problems, and cognitive decline. Medieval people experience this as increasing forgetfulness, difficulty learning new skills, and personality changes. Older workers are often described as being simple or slow, but this isn't just aging, it's the cumulative effect of years of alcohol-induced brain damage. Your digestive system is a disaster. Chronic drinking causes gastritis, ulcers, and damage to your intestinal lining. You have constant stomach pain, frequent diarrhea, and difficulty absorbing nutrients from what little food you eat. This compounds the malnutrition you're already experiencing from a poor diet, creating a downward spiral of declining health. The vitamin deficiencies caused by chronic alcohol consumption are causing specific conditions. Thiamine, vitamin B1 deficiency, leads to beriberi, causing nerve damage, muscle weakness, and potentially fatal heart problems. You might develop wet beriberi with fluid buildup and heart failure, or dry beriberi with nerve damage and paralysis. Medieval people have no idea why some heavy drinkers suddenly can't walk properly, or why their hearts give out. Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome, caused by severe thiamine deficiency, is turning some chronic drinkers into confused, disoriented people who can't form new memories and confabulate stories to fill in the gaps. They become the village simpletons, unable to work, often dependent on charity or family care, with no one understanding that alcohol destroyed their brains. Your immune system is compromised. Heavy drinking suppresses immune function, making you more susceptible to every disease floating around your medieval community. And there are a lot of diseases: tuberculosis, pneumonia, dysentery, plague when it comes through. Heavy drinkers catch everything and have a harder time recovering. Injuries heal more slowly or don't heal properly at all. Alcohol impairs wound healing, so that cut you got in a tavern fight last week is infected and not closing up. The broken bone from when you fell down drunk 2 months ago didn't set properly because you couldn't afford to stop working, and you were probably drunk while it was healing. For women, the consequences are even more dire. Heavy drinking disrupts menstrual cycles, reduces fertility, and causes complications in pregnancy. Women who drink heavily throughout pregnancy, and remember, they're drinking ale because water isn't safe, are giving birth to babies with what we'd now recognise as fetal alcohol syndrome. These children are born smaller, with distinctive facial features, learning disabilities, and behavioural problems. Medieval people noticed that some babies are weakly or simple, but don't make the connection to maternal alcohol consumption. Your teeth are rotting out of your head. The combination of poor dental hygiene, a diet heavy in grain-based alcohol, and the acid from frequent vomiting is destroying your teeth. By your 30s, you might have lost half your teeth. By your 40s, you might have hardly any left. This makes eating difficult, which worsens your already poor nutrition, which makes you drink more because liquid calories are easier than solid food. You're aging rapidly. Chronic heavy drinking causes premature aging. Your skin becomes leathery and wrinkled. Your hair greys early. You develop that characteristic hard living appearance. A 40-year-old chronic drinker in medieval times might look 60 by modern standards. Sleep is a joke. Alcohol disrupts normal sleep patterns, preventing you from getting truly restorative rest. You pass out drunk, but you're not sleeping properly. You're not getting REM sleep. You're waking up multiple times during the night to urinate, or because of withdrawal symptoms. You're caught in a cycle of being exhausted, but never actually resting well. And here's the truly dark part. Medieval people notice all of these health effects, but they draw completely wrong conclusions. They see that the village drunk has yellow skin and a swollen belly, and decide he's been cursed or has an imbalance of yellow bile. They see someone developing dementia from chronic alcohol abuse and decide they're possessed or being punished by God. They see babies born with developmental problems and blame the mother's sin or the star's alignment at birth. Nobody makes the connection that the ubiquitous drinking culture is slowly killing everyone. How could they? Alcohol is medicine. It's food. It's the safe alternative to water. The idea that it could be causing all these health problems would seem absurd when the alternative is drinking contaminated water and dying of dysentery. So people continue to drink, continue to suffer these consequences, and die younger and sicker than they would in a world with clean water and understanding of alcohol's effects. Chapter 9. The Social Destruction and Family Impact. Beyond the physical devastation, let's talk about what heavy drinking culture is doing to medieval society and families, because the social consequences are equally brutal. First, understand that the family structure in medieval times is already fragile. Infant mortality is around 30 to 50%. Women frequently die in childbirth. Disease carries off people at every age. Families are constantly losing members and restructuring. Now add chronic alcoholism to this already precarious situation. The primary breadwinner, usually the father, who drinks heavily is unreliable. He might lose days of work to being too drunk or too hungover to function. In a subsistence economy where you're living hand to mouth, losing even a few days of work can be catastrophic. The family goes hungry. Rent doesn't get paid. Debts accumulate. But he can't stop drinking because all his social and business contacts happen in the tavern. His professional network, his job opportunities, his standing in the community, All of it requires participating in drinking culture. It's a trap with no escape. The money spent on drink is money not spent on food, clothing or shelter. A labourer might earn pennies per day, and a significant portion of that goes straight to the tavern keeper. His family makes do with less food, worse housing, cheaper clothes. The children are undernourished and more susceptible to disease. Domestic violence is rampant. Alcohol removes inhibitions and increases aggression. Men come home drunk and take out their frustrations about work, about poverty, about life, on their wives and children. There's no domestic violence law, no social services, no shelters. Women and children just have to endure it. The wives of heavy drinkers are caught in an impossible situation. They can't leave. Where would they go? How would they support themselves? Medieval women have very limited economic options. They're dependent on their husbands, so they have to tolerate the drinking, the violence, the poverty it causes. Some women drink heavily themselves, either to cope with their situations or because they're working as brewsters, female brewers, or tavern keepers, and have constant access. A mother who's chronically drunk can't properly care for her children. Infants are neglected. Young children are unsupervised. The mortality rate in these families is even higher than the already terrible baseline. Children growing up in households with heavy drinkers are learning that this is normal adult behaviour. They're being socialised into the same drinking culture. By the time they're teenagers, they're already drinking heavily themselves, perpetuating the cycle into the next generation. The community fabric is fraying. Tavern fights escalate into blood feuds. Drunken insults become serious grievances. People make bad business deals while intoxicated, and then can't or won't honour them when sober. Trust breaks down. Communities that need to cooperate to survive become fractious and divided. Crime rates are directly linked to drinking patterns. Theft, assault, murder. Most of it happens when people are drunk. The crude justice system of medieval times tries to address this with harsh punishments, but it doesn't work because the drinking culture is too deeply embedded. Religious authorities are aware of the problem. Sermons rail against drunkenness. It's technically considered a sin, gluttony, or at minimum a lack of temperance. But the church is also deeply involved in alcohol production. Monasteries are major producers of beer and wine. Church festivals and holy days are occasions for drinking. The church's message is hopelessly muddled. Some people do recognise alcoholism as a problem and try to quit, but there's no support system, no AA meetings, no rehabilitation programs, no medical understanding of addiction or withdrawal. If you try to quit drinking, you're on your own, still, living in a society where drinking is omnipresent and expected. Withdrawal from chronic heavy drinking can be fatal, but medieval people don't understand this. They just know that sometimes when people stop drinking, they get very sick. Tremors, hallucinations, seizures. This might be interpreted as possession or divine punishment, making people even less likely to attempt sobriety. The economic impact on communities is staggering. A significant portion of grain production goes to making alcohol instead of food. Workers are operating at reduced capacity due to constant hangovers. Productivity is lower than it could be. Innovation and improvement are stifled because everyone is operating in a constant fog of alcohol and recovery. Some medieval cities try to regulate taverns, limiting operating hours, requiring licenses, imposing fines for serving obviously drunk customers. But enforcement is spotty at best, and the regulations often just drive drinking into informal spaces that are even less safe. The cycle is self-perpetuating. Children growing up in this culture see drinking as normal, necessary, and inevitable. They lack models of healthy relationships with alcohol or sobriety. By the time they're adults, they're already embedded in the same destructive patterns as their parents. And again, Nobody can clearly identify alcohol as the root cause of these social problems, because alcohol is also the solution to other problems, namely the lack of safe drinking water. The thing that's destroying families and communities is also the thing keeping people from dying of waterborne diseases. It's an impossible situation with no clear path out. Chapter 10. The special occasions that got really out of hand. So far we've talked about normal, everyday drinking, but medieval people didn't just drink heavily on random Tuesday nights. They had special occasions where the drinking went from heavy to absolutely apocalyptic, and these events are worth discussing separately because they were uniquely dangerous. Let's start with weddings. A medieval wedding feast isn't the refined, semi-formal affair you might attend today. It's a multi-day drinking marathon that could involve the entire village or town. The goal is to drink enough alcohol to bankrupt the host, ideally while eating everything not nailed down. The celebration starts the night before the wedding and continues for days after. People are expected to drink continuously. There are drinking contests, toasts every few minutes, and constant pressure to keep consuming. The bride and groom are expected to drink more than anyone. It's seen as good luck. Getting the couple completely wasted is part of the tradition. Consummation of the marriage is supposed to happen on the wedding night, but half the time both bride and groom are so drunk they can barely stand, let alone perform. The wedding party often escorts them to the bedroom, making lewd jokes and commentary, sometimes even staying to watch the initial proceedings before being kicked out. It's invasive, embarrassing, and made infinitely worse by everyone involved being completely inebriated. Harvest festivals are another drinking disaster waiting to happen. After months of hard labour bringing in the crops, everyone celebrates by consuming as much of the harvest as possible in fermented form. The lord of the manor might provide ale for all the workers. Entire barrels are broached and drained in single nights. These festivals often involve bonfires, dancing, and increasingly poor decisions. People who've been working together all season have grievances and grudges, and alcohol brings them all to the surface. Fights break out, property gets damaged. People end up in relationships they'll regret when sober. Occasionally someone falls into the bonfire, or drowns in a nearby stream because they wandered off drunk and passed out in a dangerous location. Religious festivals, Christmas, Easter, saints' days, are also major drinking occasions. The church officially disapproves of excessive drinking, but also provides the alcohol for many of these celebrations. The cognitive dissonance is remarkable. You'll attend Mass in the morning and be falling down drunk by afternoon, and the priest who gave the sermon about temperance is right there drinking with you. Carnival or Shrovetide, the period before Lent, is particularly wild. It's the last chance to engage in pleasures of the flesh before the austerity of Lent, so people go absolutely crazy. Days of continuous drinking, eating, dancing, and debauchery. The social order temporarily inverts. Servants mock masters, men dress as women. Everything is permitted, and everyone is completely wasted the entire time. When Lent actually starts, there's a collective hangover that lasts for days. Ironically, the enforced period of reduced alcohol consumption during Lent is probably healthier for everyone, even though it's framed as deprivation and sacrifice. May Day celebrations involve all-night drinking and dancing around maypoles. The sexual element is strong. These festivals often lead to pregnancies among unmarried couples. The combination of alcohol, darkness, and festival atmosphere creates situations that would be considered scandalous in the sober light of day. Guild festivals and craft celebrations are drinking occasions organised by professional associations. If you're a member of the Blacksmiths Guild or the Weavers Guild, you're expected to attend these events and drink with your fellow craftsmen. It's networking, bonding, and getting completely obliterated all at once. Military celebrations after victories or at the end of campaigns are legendary for their excess. Soldiers who've been living on short rations and constant danger suddenly have access to looted wine and ale. They drink until they pass out, fight each other, terrorize local populations, and generally create chaos. Many soldiers die in drunken accidents shortly after surviving battles. Funerals are paradoxically heavy drinking occasions. You're supposed to drink to the memory of the deceased, share stories about them, and drown your grief in alcohol. The wake can last for days, with mourners maintaining a continuous state of intoxication. The idea is to celebrate the person's life, but it often just turns into everyone getting drunk and forgetting why they're there. On all of these special occasions, the normal social constraints are even further loosened. Things that would get you in trouble on a regular day are permitted during festivals. Fights that would normally lead to legal consequences are overlooked as festival high spirits. Sexual encounters that would be scandalous are winked at as what happens during carnival. But the consequences don't disappear just because everyone agrees to look the other way during the festival. People still get injured or killed. Pregnancies still happen. Property damage still needs to be repaired. Relationships are still damaged. The morning after, or days after, these celebrations, communities have to reckon with what happened, and it's not always pretty. The drinking during these special occasions also establishes patterns and expectations. If you don't participate fully, if you don't drink as much as everyone else, you're marking yourself as outside the community. You're not a team player. You're not honouring the occasion properly. The social pressure during these events is even more intense than normal tavern drinking. And because these special occasions punctuate the entire year, there's always another one coming. You barely recover from the Christmas drinking before there's a wedding to attend. The Harvest Festival overlaps with the Saints' Day celebration. Between regular tavern visits and special occasions, you're spending a significant portion of your life either drunk, hungover, or preparing to get drunk again. Chapter 11. The few who tried to quit and usually failed. Now let's talk about the people who somehow, against all odds and social pressure, recognized that the drinking was destroying them and tried to stop. Their stories are particularly tragic because medieval society offered them essentially no support. First, you have to understand that the concept of alcoholism as a disease didn't exist yet. If someone drank too much, it was seen as a moral failing, a lack of willpower, or a sin. There was no medical understanding of addiction, no recognition of withdrawal, no framework for understanding that their body had become physically dependent on alcohol. So when someone decided to quit drinking, they were on their own. Let's say you're a 30-year-old labourer who's been drinking multiple gallons of ale per day for 15 years. You've noticed that your health is deteriorating, your family is suffering, and your life is spiralling downward. You make a decision. You're going to stop drinking. The first problem, you still can't drink water safely. So what are you going to consume for hydration? Your options are extremely limited. Maybe you can afford milk, though milk spoilage is a serious issue. Maybe you can get fruit juices, though these are expensive and seasonal. Maybe you can boil water if you have fuel and time, though you don't really understand why this would make it safer. Most people attempting sobriety would still drink small ale, the weakest version given to children, because it was the only safe liquid reliably available. But this meant maintaining at least a low level of alcohol consumption, which made true sobriety nearly impossible. The second problem, withdrawal. If you've been drinking heavily for years and suddenly stop, your body rebels violently. In severe cases, alcohol withdrawal can be fatal. Symptoms include tremors so severe you can't hold objects or feed yourself, profuse sweating and chills alternating, hallucinations, seeing things that aren't there, hearing voices, severe anxiety and panic, seizures that could kill you, delirium tremens, where you're completely disconnected from reality, A medieval person experiencing these symptoms has no idea what's happening to them. They might think they're possessed by demons. Their family might think they're cursed or being punished by God. There's no medical intervention available. You just have to survive it or not. Many people experiencing severe withdrawal symptoms would start drinking again just to make the symptoms stop. And they would stop. Alcohol withdrawal symptoms are immediately relieved by consuming alcohol. This created a trap where attempting sobriety made you so sick that drinking seemed like the only solution. The third problem: social isolation. Remember, the tavern is the centre of social life. All your friendships, your business connections, your social standing, it's all tied to tavern culture. If you stop drinking, you stop going to the tavern. And if you stop going to the tavern, you're cutting yourself off from your entire social network. People who attempted sobriety often found themselves isolated and alone. Former drinking buddies would mock them or exclude them. They'd lose job opportunities because deals were made over drinks and they weren't there. Their social standing would decline because they weren't participating in community activities. Some people tried to still attend the tavern but not drink, which was even worse. You'd sit there in the smoky room surrounded by drunk people watching them have fun while you drank. What? Nothing? Small ale while everyone else got wasted? You'd be the subject of mockery, the target of peer pressure, the person everyone tried to fix by convincing you to just have one drink. The fourth problem: underlying reasons for drinking. People weren't drinking just for fun. They were drinking to cope with grinding poverty, back-breaking labour, constant pain, grief from losing children, trauma from violence, and the general awfulness of medieval existence. If you stopped drinking, all of those problems were still there, but now you had no escape from them. Sobriety meant facing the full horror of your life with clarity and no buffer. For many people, that was unbearable. The depression and despair that came with sobriety often drove them back to drinking just to make existence tolerable again. Religious conversions sometimes motivated sobriety attempts. If someone had a profound religious experience or decided to take their faith more seriously, they might try to give up excessive drinking. Monasteries and convents provided one of the few environments where sobriety was possible because they had structured lives, community support, and access to boiled water and other non-alcoholic beverages. Some people did successfully quit drinking by entering religious life. They'd join a monastery or become an anchorite, but this required giving up literally everything else about your life, your family, your work, your freedom. It was trading one extreme for another. There are occasional records of individuals who managed to quit drinking and maintain sobriety while still living in society. These people were exceptional and rare. They usually had strong support from a spouse or family member, some alternative source of income that didn't require tavern socializing, and often a religious motivation that sustained them through the difficulties. But these success stories were so rare that they were remarked upon as unusual. The default expectation was that if you drank heavily, you'd continue drinking heavily until you died. Attempts to quit were seen as laudable, but ultimately futile. People would commend your willpower while fully expecting you to fail. The lack of understanding about addiction meant that relapse was seen as a complete moral failure rather than a predictable part of the recovery process. If you tried to quit and failed, you were weak, sinful, and lacking in character. The shame of relapse often led to even heavier drinking than before. For women, attempting sobriety was even more complicated. If you were a brewster or worked in a tavern, sobriety meant giving up your livelihood. If you were married to a heavy drinker, attempting sobriety while he continued drinking was nearly impossible. The gender dynamics of medieval society meant women had even less autonomy to make these choices. Children who grew up watching parents struggle with drinking and fail at sobriety learned that addiction was inescapable. This reinforced the cycle into the next generation. If your father tried and failed to quit drinking multiple times, why would you bother trying when your turn came? Chapter 12. The grim reality of where this all ended. Let's talk about how the story of medieval drinking culture typically ended for individuals, because it's important to understand that this wasn't a sustainable lifestyle. It was a slow-motion disaster that claimed people in various horrible ways. For most chronic heavy drinkers, death came earlier than it should have. Remember, average life expectancy in medieval times was already low, maybe 30 to 40 years if you survived childhood. But heavy drinkers often didn't even make it that far. Liver failure was a common end. Your liver, after years of processing alcohol, simply gives up. You develop ascites, your belly swells with fluid, becoming grotesquely distended. Your skin and eyes turn yellow from jaundice. You can't eat because you're constantly nauseous. You're confused and disoriented as toxins build up in your blood. Eventually, you slip into a coma and die. Medieval people watching this happen don't understand it as liver failure. They see it as a mysterious wasting disease or divine punishment. Your family watches you deteriorate over weeks or months, unable to do anything to help. You die in your home, probably in significant pain, with no understanding of what's killing you. Heart failure takes others. Your weakened, enlarged heart simply stops being able to pump effectively. You become short of breath from minimal exertion. Your legs swell with fluid. You can't lie flat because you can't breathe. One day your heart just stops, or you develop a fatal arrhythmia. You're dead at 35, and everyone just accepts it as the will of God. Accidents claim a large number of heavy drinkers. Remember all those nights stumbling home drunk through dark streets. Eventually your luck runs out. You fall into a river and drown. You pass out in the wrong place and freeze to death. You stumble in front of a horse cart. You fall down stairs. You wander into a dangerous area and get robbed and killed. These deaths are so common that they barely register as remarkable. He died in an accident covers everything from fell drunk into a well to got stabbed in a tavern fight. The role of alcohol in these deaths is recognized, but not really addressed because everyone's doing the same thing. Violence is another major cause of death. That tavern fight that's been simmering for weeks finally explodes and someone draws a knife. You're collateral damage in someone else's drunken dispute. You insult the wrong person while drunk and they remember it when they're sober. Medieval violence is brutal and often fatal because medical care for injuries is primitive at best. Infections from injuries sustained while drunk kill people regularly. You cut yourself while drunk, don't clean it properly, or at all, and it gets infected. Without antibiotics, infections can progress to sepsis and death. A simple cut becomes a death sentence. Exposure and neglect claim those who've descended into complete alcoholism. There are people in every medieval community who are so dependent on alcohol that they've lost everything: home, family, work. They live on the streets or in abandoned buildings, begging for money to buy more drink. They die of exposure, malnutrition, or diseases that ravage bodies can't fight off. These people are the visible cautionary tales that everyone points to while continuing their own heavy drinking. At least I'm not as bad as poor Thomas who sleeps in doorways, they say, while drinking themselves toward the same fate just at a slower pace. Some people die suddenly from what we'd now recognize as alcohol poisoning. They drink too much too fast, maybe at a festival or celebration, and their body just shuts down. They pass out and never wake up, or they vomit while unconscious and choke to death. In medieval understanding, they just died from drink, and it happens often enough that it's not even particularly noteworthy. Women face additional dangers. Drinking during pregnancy leads to miscarriages, stillbirths, and complications in childbirth. Women already face a 1 to 2% chance of dying with each pregnancy in medieval times. Alcohol makes those odds worse. The babies who do survive often have health problems that medieval people can observe but not explain. For the very few who survive into old age while continuing to drink heavily, the end is typically prolonged misery, dementia from decades of alcohol-induced brain damage, multiple organ failures happening simultaneously, bodies that are broken down from years of abuse. They're alive, but barely, and often completely dependent on family members who may or may not be able or willing to care for them. The community's response to these deaths is a mix of resignation and moralizing. The church preaches about temperance and the evils of drunkenness, but offers no practical solutions. Families mourn but often continue the same patterns. Communities observe that heavy drinking leads to early death but see no alternative. What's particularly tragic is that many of these deaths were preventable, not in medieval context where they didn't have the knowledge or infrastructure, but from a modern perspective. These are people who were killing themselves slowly with alcohol because they literally had no access to safe drinking water. Their choice to drink was really no choice at all. The economic impact of these early deaths is significant but hard to measure. Skilled workers dying in their prime means lost knowledge and productivity. Families losing breadwinners means more poverty and dependence on community charity. Children orphaned by alcohol-related deaths face even worse prospects than normal. And here's the darkest irony: the deaths don't change anything. Each generation watches the previous one drink itself to death and then does exactly the same thing, because the underlying problem, unsafe water, never gets solved. The drinking culture is locked in place by necessity, even as everyone can see it's killing them. Chapter 13. The Rare Alternatives and What They Tell Us Now. It's worth talking about the few alternatives to constant drinking that existed in medieval times, because they're so rare and difficult that they actually prove how trapped people were in this system. In wealthy monasteries and some aristocratic households, they had access to boiled beverages. Tea and coffee haven't reached Europe yet, but some places made tisanes, herbal infusions in boiled water. The boiling process killed the harmful bacteria, making the water safe to drink, though they didn't understand why this worked. But boiling water required fuel, time, and containers that could withstand heat. For the average person, this wasn't practical. Fuel was expensive. You needed it for cooking and heating. Wasting it just to boil drinking water seemed absurd when ale was readily available. Some religious communities had access to wells or springs that were genuinely clean. Monasteries built in certain locations might have pristine water sources. They could drink water safely and didn't need to maintain the same level of alcohol consumption. This is one reason why monastic communities often appeared healthier and lived longer than secular populations. But these clean water sources were rare and couldn't be replicated everywhere. You couldn't just dig a well anywhere and expect clean water. Groundwater contamination was widespread due to human and animal waste seeping into the water table. In some Mediterranean regions, particularly in wine-producing areas, people drank more wine and less ale. Wine has higher alcohol content, so you could theoretically drink less volume and get the same antibacterial benefits. But wine was more expensive for most people, and the drinking culture still meant consuming significant quantities. Milk was an alternative in pastoral areas. Fresh milk spoils quickly without refrigeration, but in places where dairy farming was common, people could drink milk that was only hours old. However, milk was often needed for butter and cheese production, which could be stored. Drinking the milk meant losing those preservation options. Fermented milk products like kefir existed in some regions. These provided safe, non-alcoholic, or very low alcohol hydration. But these traditions were localized and not widespread across medieval Europe. Some people drank fruit juices when available: apple juice, grape juice during harvest season, berry juices. But these were seasonal, couldn't be stored for long, and were often fermented into cider or wine precisely because fermentation was the only way to preserve them. Honey water, or mead in very diluted form, provided another option, but honey was expensive. Only wealthier households could afford to use honey for regular hydration rather than saving it for special occasions or trade. The fact that these alternatives were so limited and so dependent on wealth or specific circumstances shows how locked in place the drinking culture was. It wasn't just tradition or social pressure, it was practical necessity for most people. There are records of physicians and learned people recommending against excessive drinking. Medical texts from the period discuss the harmful effects of drunkenness, but their advice is useless because they don't offer practical alternatives. Drink less ale is fine advice if you have access to safe water, but no one does. Some cities and towns tried to regulate water quality. There were laws against throwing waste into certain wells or streams designated for drinking. Penalties existed for contaminating water sources, but enforcement was minimal, and people often ignored these regulations because there was nowhere else to dispose of waste. The rare individuals who managed to avoid heavy drinking were usually either very wealthy, very religious, or very lucky in terms of access to clean water sources. They weren't following some secret knowledge or special discipline. They simply had access to resources most people didn't. This is important to understand, because it removes the element of moral judgment. Medieval people weren't drinking themselves to death because they lacked willpower or were particularly sinful. They were trapped in a system where alcohol was the only safe beverage available to most people, and the culture that developed around this necessity became self-perpetuating. The villages and towns that happened to have genuinely clean water sources, usually because of fortunate geology or careful community management, showed measurably better health outcomes. People lived longer, infant mortality was lower, productivity was higher. But these benefits were attributed to all sorts of other factors, not the quality of the drinking water. Nobody made the connection that access to clean water was the fundamental difference. The germ theory of disease wouldn't be understood for centuries. People could observe that the village by the mountain spring is healthier than the village by the river, but they'd attribute it to better air, favourable stars, God's blessing, or any number of other explanations. This meant that the solution to the drinking crisis was literally staring people in the face for centuries, but they couldn't see it. Clean water was the answer, but they didn't know what the question was. Chapter 14. The cultural blind spots that kept the cycle going. One of the most fascinating and tragic aspects of medieval drinking culture is how many warning signs were visible, yet completely ignored or misinterpreted. Let's talk about the cultural blind spots that prevented people from recognizing alcohol as a serious health crisis. First, there's the perception of alcohol as medicine. Medieval medical theory based on the four humours held that different beverages had different properties. Wine was considered heating and drying. Ale was moistening. Doctors prescribed specific drinks for specific conditions. Feeling cold? Drink wine to warm your humours. Feeling too dry? Drink ale to moisten your constitution. This medicinal framing meant that excessive drinking could be justified as healthcare. I'm not drinking to get drunk. I'm balancing my humours. The fact that this medicine made you feel terrible the next day and was clearly damaging your health long term didn't register as evidence against the theory. Doctors would even prescribe alcohol for conditions that alcohol actually made worse. Stomach pain? Drink some ale to settle it. Sleep problems? Wine before bed. Anxiety? More drink. The temporary relief masked the long-term harm, creating a cycle of symptom, treatment, worsening condition, and more treatment. Second, there's the religious framework that created contradictions. Christianity preached temperance and moderation. Drunkenness was officially sinful. biblical passages condemned excessive drinking. Sermons regularly railed against the evils of intoxication, but the same church produced vast quantities of wine and ale. Monasteries were major brewers and vintners. Church festivals were drinking occasions. Wine was literally the blood of Christ in communion. The religious infrastructure was deeply invested in alcohol production and consumption. This meant the church's message was hopelessly muddled. Don't drink too much was the sermon, but here's the wine we made was the practice. The cognitive dissonance was never resolved. People absorbed the message that drinking was both sinful and sacred, excessive but necessary, to be avoided but also celebrated. Third, there's the class dimension that obscured the problem. Wealthy people had access to better quality alcohol and could afford to drink wine instead of ale. They often had access to cleaner water sources and could afford the fuel to boil water. Their drinking, while still heavy by modern standards, was somewhat more moderate. The real destruction happened among the poor, who drank the cheapest, strongest stuff they could get, and drank it in larger quantities. But the poor were already living in terrible conditions with high mortality rates. The additional damage from heavy drinking was just part of the general background misery of poverty. The wealthy observers who wrote the historical records we have today didn't always connect the dots between heavy drinking and poor health outcomes among the lower classes because there were so many other factors at play. Malnutrition, dangerous work, poor housing, lack of medical care. Alcohol was just one more stress on bodies that were already being destroyed by poverty. Fourth, there's the survivor bias that made the problem seem less severe than it was. The people you saw in the tavern regularly were the survivors, people whose bodies could tolerate years of heavy drinking. The people who died young from alcohol-related causes weren't around to be counted. This created a false impression of how dangerous the lifestyle was. Old drunk William is 50 years old and still going strong. Yes, but you're forgetting the 20 guys who died before 40 who were drinking the same way. William is the exception, not the rule, but he's the visible example that people focused on. Fifth, there's the normalization of dysfunction. When everyone is hungover, being hungover is normal. When everyone has health problems related to drinking, those problems don't register as unusual or preventable. They're just part of life. The baseline for health was already so low that alcohol-induced decline didn't stand out. Everyone had stomach problems. Everyone was frequently ill. Everyone had aches and pains. Teasing apart which symptoms were from drinking versus general medieval life was impossible. Sixth, there's the lack of alternative explanations. When people noticed that heavy drinkers developed certain patterns of illness, they couldn't explain it through modern medical understanding, because that knowledge didn't exist yet. So they attributed it to other causes: bad air, imbalanced humours, moral weakness, curses, divine punishment, astrological influences. Without germ theory, without understanding of organ function, without knowledge of how alcohol is processed by the body, they couldn't make the causal connection between consumption and consequences. They observed correlation, but couldn't establish causation. Seventh, there's the short-term thinking forced by immediate survival needs. Even if you suspected that drinking might be harming you long-term, your short-term need for safe hydration and social connection overrode those concerns. Tomorrow's potential liver failure was less important than today's thirst and tonight's need to maintain your social network. This wasn't irrational. It was a rational response to impossible circumstances. When you're choosing between possible long-term harm and certain short-term problems, you choose to address the short-term problems. Eighth, there's the feedback loop of alcohol affecting judgment. The very thing that was clouding people's ability to recognize the problem was alcohol itself. Chronic heavy drinking impairs cognitive function, making it harder to engage in the kind of abstract reasoning that would allow you to connect. long-term patterns and outcomes. People were essentially trying to evaluate whether alcohol was harming them while their brains were marinated in alcohol. The tool they needed for assessment was the same tool being damaged by the substance in question. Conclusion: why you wouldn't last and what it teaches us. So we've taken this journey through medieval drinking culture, and if you're still with me, you now understand why the title of this video is absolutely accurate. You wouldn't last a night of medieval drinking, let alone a lifestyle of it. Think about what we've covered. You'd be drinking multiple gallons of questionable liquid every day, not because you wanted to, but because the alternative was dying of waterborne diseases. You'd be consuming alcohol from the moment you woke up until you passed out at night, maintaining a constant low-level intoxication just to stay hydrated. When you decided to actually get drunk, to go beyond the maintenance, drinking, you'd be consuming beverages that were unpredictable in strength, potentially contaminated with psychoactive additives, and served in containers that had never been properly cleaned. You'd be doing this in smoke-filled rooms packed with armed strangers who were just as intoxicated as you were. The hangover would be catastrophic. No pain relief, no safe water to rehydrate, no comfortable place to recover, and no option to call in sick. You'd have to work through it, performing physical labour while your body was shutting down, only to repeat the cycle that same evening. Your body would deteriorate rapidly. Liver damage, heart problems, brain damage, malnutrition, compromised immune system, all of it happening simultaneously with no medical intervention available. You'd age prematurely, develop chronic health conditions, and likely die young from causes directly or indirectly related to alcohol consumption. Your social life, your family, your economic prospects, all of it would be tangled up with drinking culture in ways that made escape impossible. Trying to quit would isolate you socially, potentially destroy your livelihood, and make you physically ill from withdrawal, all while you still had no access to safe drinking water. The psychological toll would be immense, living in constant discomfort, watching people around you suffer and die from the same patterns you're trapped in, being unable to change the system that's destroying everyone. The drinking would be both the problem and the only escape from the problem. But here's what this history teaches us that's actually important. First, it shows how infrastructure shapes culture in ways people living in that culture can't even see. Medieval people didn't choose drinking culture because they were morally weak or loved alcohol more than modern people do. They were locked into it by the absence of clean water infrastructure. The culture that developed around this necessity then took on a life of its own, but the root cause was infrastructural. This is relevant today because we often judge behaviours without understanding the systems that make those behaviours necessary or rational. Before condemning how people behave, we should ask what systemic constraints are shaping those behaviours. Second, it demonstrates how solving one problem can solve cascading secondary problems. Clean water infrastructure didn't just solve the hydration problem, it addressed alcoholism, improved public health, reduced violence, stabilised families, improved productivity, and extended life expectancy. One infrastructural change had massive ripple effects. This suggests that addressing root causes, even when difficult and expensive, can be more effective than treating symptoms. Medieval moralists preaching about temperance didn't reduce drinking. Building clean water systems eventually did. Third, it shows the importance of scientific understanding in improving human welfare. For centuries, people suffered because they didn't understand germ theory or how alcohol affects the body. Once that knowledge became available, solutions became possible. Investment in scientific research and education has concrete benefits for human well-being. Fourth, it's a reminder of how much modern life is built on invisible infrastructure and accumulated knowledge that we take completely for granted. You turn on a tap, and safe water comes out, this is a miracle that most of human history didn't have access to. The mundane conveniences of modern life represent countless generations of accumulated knowledge and massive investments in infrastructure. Fifth, it provides perspective on our current relationship with alcohol. We still have problems with alcohol abuse in modern society, but we're dealing with them in a completely different context. We have safe alternatives to alcohol for hydration. We understand addiction. We have treatment options. We have regulations around production quality and alcohol content. The problems remain, but the context is radically different. When you pour yourself a drink tonight, you're making a choice that medieval people didn't have. You can drink water instead. You can moderate your consumption. You can seek help if drinking becomes a problem. These options didn't exist for most of human history. Sixth, it highlights the often invisible role of women in historical survival. Women were the primary brewers in medieval society, the brewsters who made ale that kept communities alive. This labour was essential, but often overlooked in historical accounts that focused on male activities. Understanding medieval drinking culture requires recognising women's central role in beverage production. Finally, this history is a testament to human resilience. Medieval people lived in circumstances that would break most of us, yet they survived, raised families, created art and culture, and laid the groundwork for the modern world. They did this while navigating a drinking culture that was slowly destroying them because they had no alternative. Their survival wasn't because drinking was good for them. It was in spite of the damage it caused. They endured conditions that shouldn't have been survivable, and they did it with courage, humour, and community bonds forged in those terrible taverns. So the next time you complain about a hangover after a night out with friends, remember, you chose to drink. You had safe water available. You have pain relievers and comfortable places to recover. Your one bad night is incomparable to the daily reality of medieval existence. And that's exactly why you wouldn't last. Not because you're weak, but because you haven't spent your entire life adapted to a system where constant intoxication was the price of staying alive. Medieval drinking culture was a tragedy created by necessity, perpetuated by ignorance, and only resolved by the infrastructure and knowledge that modernity finally provided. Understanding this history should make us grateful for clean water, aware of how systems shape behaviour, and committed to addressing root causes of social problems rather than just treating symptoms. If this video has given you a new appreciation for the simple miracle of safe drinking water, or made you think differently about how infrastructure shapes culture, then hitting that subscribe button and sharing this with others helps spread that perspective. Because understanding how people lived and suffered in the past helps us appreciate what we have now and think more clearly about the challenges we still face. The medieval drinker couldn't escape their trap. We can learn from their experience and make better choices about the traps we're building for ourselves. Thanks for watching, and remember, the next time you're feeling grateful for something, add clean water infrastructure to the list. It's literally the foundation of modern civilization, and most people never think about it. Stay curious, stay hydrated with water, and I'll see you in the next video.